York Times quoting, "It is a courtesy formula. If the US wanted to act without asking, it could simply inform Denmark that it is building a base, an airfield, or a port." End quote. It's a similar situation where access to Greenland's critical minerals are concerned. The Wall Street Journal notes that, quote, "American companies already have mining and other economic rights of Greenland," with Nook indicating that it's open to expanding those rights even further. This is one of the major reasons why Europe is so uneasy about Trump's annexation comments. The US can already act pretty much how it wants in Greenland, and the Financial Times reports that Copenhagen is happy to sweeten the deal even further, perhaps even declaring American bases on the island to be sovereign US territory. Yet such deals have so far been rejected or ignored, all while Trump belittles new Danish defense spending on the territory to the tune of billions of dollars. The fear in Europe is that this means the White House won't be satisfied with anything but annexation. But that logic also flows the other way. Europeans are not the only ones who are aware that the US has nothing to materially gain by invading and occupying the island. American members of Congress, military officers, and hopefully members of the public can see it too. And to our mind, that makes military action less likely, not more. So to return to the main theme of this video, it's one thing to depose the hated dictator of a nation deeply opposed to America, one where Chinese and Russian influence is real and tangible. It is another to violently overthrow the democratically elected government of a territory overseen by a treaty ally, all while gaining no material advantage in return. Now, we want to be clear that we are not saying that the US will never acquire Greenland. Times change. The voting population of Greenland is small, and voluntary union with the US might be something Greenlanders decide that they want at some point down the line. Nor are we trying to paint Greenland's relationship with Denmark as all warm and cozy and equal. There are bitter memories of direct rule from Copenhagen, and polling consistently shows that a vast majority of Greenlanders want eventual independence from the kingdom. But we are saying that all the factors we've highlighted so far make an American use of force to annex Greenland both unlikely and counterproductive, possibly even to the extent of causing a permanent rupture within Trump's coalition. Instead, the likeliest outcome seems to be an ongoing influence campaign to try and nudge Greenlanders into embracing America of their own accord, one that may be coupled with a campaign of pressure or coercion against Denmark. Yet even here, the outcome is far from certain. On social media sites like X, it's common to see hot takes flying around about how America could just offer every Greenlander, say, $5 million each to join the US and then smugly sit back as they all come running to Uncle Sam. But polling consistently shows that while there are high-profile Greenlanders who like the sound of such a deal, the majority do not want to become Americans. Per The Economist, though most Greenlanders favor independence and the abuses by Denmark's past colonial administrations are still a neuralgic issue, they do not want to become Americans either. Minds can change, of course, but Prime Minister Nielsen has noted many times that the rhetoric of buying the island or buying off the islanders is disrespectful, smacking of the same colonialism that has turned so many Greenlanders against Denmark. Hard as it may be for some at the top of the US administration to believe, but money really isn't everything. This video is being made prior to Marco Rubio's meeting with Danish and Greenlandic leaders. It's possible that there will be some breakthrough. Maybe the administration will take a face-saving off-ramp that allows Trump to claim a win. Maybe everyone will be distracted by the collapse of the Iranian regime and Greenland will once again fade into the background. Maybe the US will even make a spectacular offer to Greenland's people that moves the dial on wanting to join America. Or maybe the issue will keep on heating up, turning into the greatest crisis in the history of NATO. Heck, maybe we'll even be proved wildly wrong, and the sight of US helicopters flying over Nuuk as gunfire sounds and explosions light up the sky will soon be beamed all over the world. For now, though, with the information that we do have, we will caution people against panicking too much. Never underestimate the power of narrative, of the ability for the ordinary Joe in the street to tell themselves that they are the good guys. When toppling a despot like Maduro or bombing a mad theocratic regime like Iran, that is easy. But after invading and occupying a peaceful island, capturing or killing its leaders, and likely killing European soldiers trying to defend that democracy, well, the American public might feel like they're in that old Mitchell and Webb Nazi sketch that became a meme, asking themselves, are we the baddies? Frankly, we think they're not. For all the might is right rhetoric from Stephen Miller or the gung-ho ravings of armchair warriors on X, our gut instinct is that there is still a large majority in the USA who would balk at their government doing something so flagrantly cruel and evil. Maybe we're being naive. Maybe the lesson of 2026 so far is that the law of the jungle is all that matters and ordinary Americans in the Midwest diners are just itching to do to Jens Friedrich Nielsen what Trump did to Maduro. But we think, we hope, that that's an incorrect read of the mood music. The guys like Miller and Trump would get a nasty shock if they really went for it. Only time will tell if our instincts are right or if this year is going to be more terrifying than even we realized. Thank you for watching.
During the 100 Years' War, France faced a formidable opponent, the invading armies of England. The English relied on a distinctive tactical system that combined the devastating firepower of their longbowmen with the steadfastness of heavily armed men-at-arms. Time and again, even numerically superior French armies struggled against this deadly combination. French commanders desperately tried to search for a way to counter the English tactics, and paid dearly for every attempt. In this video, we'll explore 8 of the most significant battles from the early stages of the 100 Years' War. We'll see how exactly the English system worked in practice, how the French tried to counter it, and how they eventually discovered a way to hold their own against the invaders from across the Channel. The 100 Years' War began in 1337. Not long after, Edward III of England pressed his claim to the French throne and crossed the Channel to assert his rights. Fully aware that France, the economic and military superpower of its time, could field larger armies, and that he would be at a disadvantage in a drawn-out war of attrition, Edward sought to force the French into a decisive battle right from the beginning. He was confident that his troops could prevail against the armies of heavily armed French knights in open field, because England had developed a very effective tactical system in its wars against the Scots. After a spectacularly failed cavalry charge against the Scottish infantry at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, the English adapted their tactics. Instead of knights on horseback, they now relied on a combination of dismounted men-at-arms and longbowmen, a combination that proved its effectiveness at the battles of Duplain Moor in 1332 and Halidon Hill in 1333. At Halidon Hill, the English took up a strong position atop a hill, forcing the Scots to attack across marshy ground, up the slope and through a storm of longbowmen's arrows. When the exhausted and battered attackers reached the English line, the dismounted men-at-arms blocked their advance, while the archers caught them in a deadly crossfire. The battle was brief, but brutal. When the Scots broke and fled, the men-at-arms remounted and chased them off the field, crushing the last remnants of resistance. By the time the English arrived in France, news of the Scots' defeats had reached the French king, Philip VI. He knew just how effective English tactics could be, and despite Edward's efforts, he avoided open battle, even when the two kings met in the field in 1339. Edward took up a strong defensive position on a hill between the villages of La Capelle and La Flamangerie, securing the front of his army with a ditch and field fortifications. Behind these defenses, the dismounted men-at-arms formed 3 solid blocks, each flanked by archers. This shows how crucial the careful selection of a strong defensive position was to the success of the English tactics. At La Flamangerie, however, it became clear that a position could be so strong that it became a deterrent. When Philip's scouts reported the English deployment, he abandoned the attack and instead dug in behind a line of abatis, field fortifications made of sharpened tree trunks and branches. His men saw this as cowardly, but though Philip's caution clashed with the French knights' ideas of honor, it spared France a potentially disastrous defeat at the very start of the war. Philip maintained this cautious approach, which meant that the first major field battle of the conflict would not be between the kings themselves, but between their deputies in the War of the Breton Succession. Between 1341 and 1345, several truces interrupted the war between England and France. During this period, the focus shifted to the War of the Breton Succession, which became a kind of proxy conflict. Two men were contenders to succeed John III, the recently deceased Duke of Brittany, John of Montfort, John III's half-brother, and Charles of Blois, the husband of John's niece and Philip VI's nephew. Naturally, Philip VI supported Charles of Blois, while Edward III backed John of Montfort. To support his candidate, Edward sent William de Bohun, the first Earl of Northampton, to Brittany. He landed at Brest in the summer of 1342, liberated the besieged city, and set out to capture the fortress of Morlaix. Charles of Blois, who had initially retreated, soon realized he had more than twice the strength of his opponent and gave chase. When the Earl of Northampton learned that the Franco-Breton army was approaching, he lifted the siege and took up a position on the edge of a grove. His force of nearly 5,000 men fortified the area with traps, cleverly camouflaged with hay and undergrowth. The exact formations and course of the battle are unclear, but chroniclers report that the English men-at-arms fought dismounted. First, they were attacked by Blois's knights on horseback, likely on the flanks, where the archers inflicted heavy losses. The French then pressed on against the center, where the traps took their toll. Despite these obstacles, the French continued their advance and clashed with the English line in a brutal hand-to-hand fight. After several hours of fierce combat, the English emerged victorious. The Battle of Morlaix not only confirmed the importance of carefully selecting and preparing a strong defensive position, but also demonstrated that the men-at-arms were the backbone of the English formations. No matter how relentless the hail of arrows from the archers, the enemy almost always reached the English front line. It was the steadfast men-at-arms who decided the battle's outcome. Without this human wall, the lightly armored archers would have little chance against a direct assault. So the English tactics relied on a kind of symbiosis. The archers weakened the enemy before they reached the men-at-arms, and the men-at-arms stopped the attackers, shielded the archers, and ultimately finished the enemy off. At Morlaix, English tactics proved their worth on French soil for the first time. Charles of Blois, one of France's most capable commanders, took the lesson to heart and immediately began searching for a way to counter the English system. The results of his efforts became clear 4 years later, the Battle of Saint-Paul-de-Léon. In 1345, Edward III broke the truce with France, which was supposed to last until the summer of 1346. He sent troops to Brittany to repel Charles of Blois and secure a potential bridgehead to land his next invasion army. After initial successes, the campaign stalled, as the English failed to capture a port in northern Brittany. By 1346, Edward had decided to land in Normandy with his main army. Still, Sir Thomas Dagworth advanced west, likely on a reconnaissance mission, and was confronted by Charles of Blois at the small town of Saint-Paul-de-Léon. Dagworth, commanding just 80 men-at-arms and 120 mounted archers, was heavily outnumbered by Blois's 1,000 men. With no chance to retreat, he had his troops dismount and take up a strong position on a hill, securing the front with a ditch and the rear with an improvised barrier of wagons and horses. Having learned from Morlaix that cavalry was highly vulnerable in a frontal assault on an English formation, Charles of Blois dismounted the majority of his men-at-arms. This made the Battle of Saint-Paul-de-Léon one of the first battles in which French men-at-arms fought on foot. Aside from reduced mobility, there were few drawbacks. The men were just as well trained for fighting on foot as on horseback. and their close combat skills had been honed in many small sieges of the early 100 Years' War. To offset the loss of mobility, Charles kept about 40 heavily armored horsemen and a division of crossbowmen in reserve at the rear. The Franco-Breton army attacked from two sides simultaneously. Charles sent his mobile striking force around Dagworth's flank to strike from the rear, while the dismounted men-at-arms assaulted the English front in waves. The flanking maneuver stalled at the English wagon line, and the archers unleashed a devastating hail of arrows on the attackers approaching the front. Despite these setbacks, the Franco-Breton forces pressed forward, and a fierce, day-long battle ensued. In the late afternoon, after his men were beaten back multiple times, Charles personally led a final assault. Against the backdrop of the setting sun, he attacked the English from all sides with 3 divisions, but was repelled once more. The Battle of Saint-Paul-de-Léon highlighted the deadly effectiveness of the English combination of dismounted men-at-arms, field fortifications, and longbowmen. Though outnumbered roughly 5-1, not a single English man-at-arms fell, while Charles of Blois lost a large proportion of his army. Even though Charles had lost at the Battle of Saint-Paul-de-Léon, French commanders recognized that dismounted men-at-arms combined with a mobile striking force offered the most promising counter to English tactics so far. Nevertheless, this approach would be put to the test when the first major field battle of the 100 Years' War took place just a few weeks later. A quick book recommendation before we go on. Bernard Cornwell's Grail Quest is a fantastic, well-researched historical fiction series that brings the battles of the early 100 Years' War to life. If you want to check it out, there's a link down below. Buying through that link gives us a small commission and no extra cost to you and really helps the channel. Prefer audiobooks? You can also grab it on Audible through our link and get a free audiobook. All links are in the description and pinned comment. Thanks for considering it, and now back to the video. When Edward III landed in Normandy with his invading army in July of 1346, he began marching through France, plundering as he went. Philip VI had little choice but to confront him. He pursued the English north from Poissy, near Paris, tried to block them at the Somme, and ultimately, near the small town of Crécy, quote, fell directly into the King of England's trap, as historian Matthew Strickland puts it. The exact deployment of the English and many other details of the Battle of Crécy remain hotly debated. This is not the place to go into those debates, especially since the battle represents a special case in terms of the French approach, as we will see. What is certain is that the English took up a strong defensive position on a hill between the villages of Crécy and Vadicourt. As had become standard practice, they secured the rear with wagons and prepared traps and field fortifications in front of the line. The dismounted men-at-arms formed 3 divisions, each flanked by archers. The head of the French column reached the battlefield shortly before midday. Despite the strong English position, Philip VI attacked before his troops were fully assembled. The reason is unclear. Some suggest political pressure compelled him to act hastily, while others say his knights urged immediate action. Whatever the reason, Philip sent his Genoese crossbowmen forward first, and instantly made a critical mistake. His mercenaries' equipment had been left at the rear of the French column, forcing them to attack with reduced armor and ammunition, and, most importantly, without the protective pavises central to their tactics. Vulnerable and exposed, they were quickly forced to fall back. The second wave, composed of mounted men-at-arms, pressed forward ruthlessly, riding over the retreating crossbowmen. This took away much of their momentum, and they lost cohesion just as they entered the range of the longbowmen. Still, the French men-at-arms reached the English right wing, commanded by Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince. Just as Edward III had intended, the terrain and English formation funneled the French into a death zone in front of the Black Prince's division. His men stood their ground, wearing down wave after wave of French attackers. The assault only ended around midnight, and the next morning the English men-at-arms mounted their horses and swept the remainder of Philip's army from the battlefield, completing one of the most one-sided victories of the 100 Years' War. Despite his caution, in the end, Philip VI did engage in battle, and paid a heavy price. The Battle of Crécy is often seen as a triumph of the longbowmen over French men-at-arms, highlighting flaws in French tactics and organization. In fact, it was not. The defeat had more to do with Philip's hasty approach. His attack was poorly coordinated, and he ignored the lessons Charles of Blois had learned during the War of the Breton Succession. The Battle of Crécy was, in the words of Matthew Strickland, quote, a disastrous shambles, unrepresentative of the real capabilities of French arms and tactical thinking, end quote. In several smaller battles over the following years, the French proved they were capable of far more than they had shown at Crécy. In 1349, Thomas Coke, the English seneschal of Gascony, was ambushed near the village of Lunalong. He immediately ordered his men-at-arms and archers to dismount and take up a strong position on a hill. The French, led by Jean de Lille, and outnumbering them roughly 3-1, attacked confidently. One division rode around the Anglo-Gascon troops to strike at their rear, while two others assaulted from the front. The troops that bypassed the English managed to seize some horses and baggage, but the frontal attackers met fierce resistance. The horses, making it through the hail of arrows, were mercilessly impaled on the spears of the dismounted men-at-arms. By evening, when Jean de Lille called off the attack, 300 of his men had fallen. The battle confirmed once and for all that frontal cavalry charges against well-deployed English troops were virtually suicidal. The combination of dismounted men-at-arms and mounted shock troops now quickly spread from Brittany into the rest of France. In 1351, when Marshal Guy II de Nesle besieged the fortress of Saint-Jean-d'Angély, he intercepted a convoy of reinforcements at the bridge over the Charente River near Taillebourg. Following Charles of Blois' example, the Marshal dismounted the bulk of his men-at-arms, only keeping 2 cavalry reserves on the wings. He then prepared to attack both frontally and from the flanks. However, the plan never came to fruition. Reinforcements from Taillebourg and Tonnay-Charente arrived near the rear, surprising Guy de Nesle before he could advance. 2 weeks later, on the 6th of June 1351, Edward I de Beaujeu attacked an English raiding party led by John de Beauchamp, the captain of Calais, near Ardres, about 600 kilometers north of Taillebourg. The retreating English took up a defensive position in a bend of the river and secured it with a ditch. Once again, the French attacked using a combination of dismounted men-at-arms and mounted shock troops. Although Edward de Beaujeu was killed at the very start of the battle, his men kept up the pressure until the English archers ran out of arrows. This allowed the French cavalry to bypass the defenders and strike from the rear. While Ardres cannot be considered a decisive success for the French method, since it was likely the lack of arrow reserves that decided the outcome, combined with Taillebourg, it does demonstrate that the tactic of dismounted men-at-arms had now spread throughout France. How promising the French approach was became clear at the Battle of Moron in 1352. This time, Guy de Nesle faced an Anglo-Breton force under Sir Walter Bentley. Bentley had positioned his men on a slight rise between a hedge and some bushes. As was now standard, about 1,500 men-at-arms formed the center, while roughly 800 archers held the wings. Again, the French attacked both frontally and on the flanks. This time, the assault force broke through at the first attempt, with devastating results. When the armored horsemen smashed into the unprotected side of the English right wing, it collapsed almost immediately, exposing the center. Meanwhile, the French men-at-arms fought their way through the bushes in front of the English position, attacking head-on and pressing the enemy against the hedge. Victory seemed within reach, until the French center suddenly faltered. On the right, part of the formation inexplicably fell back, giving the English archers an opportunity to advance and strike into the exposed flank of the French. At the Battle of Moron, the French came closer to defeating an English formation than at any point since the start of the war. Their plan had worked flawlessly until the inexplicable retreat of part of their men-at-arms disrupted the attack. This near success, however, helped shape French tactics for the next major engagement. At the Battle of Poitiers, the combination of dismounted men-at-arms and fast-moving shock troops would be deployed in a large-scale battle for the first time in the war. In 1356, the Black Prince led a chevauchée from Gascony north into Poitou. King John II pursued him and confronted the English south of Poitiers. Prince Edward, seizing a convenient opportunity for battle, chose a position perfectly suited to English tactics. A gentle slope with a few hedgerows lay in front of his troops, the forest of Noailles behind them, and the Mionçon River to their left. On the right, the English built a barricade of wagons and brushwood. Edward deployed his troops in 3 divisions, with longbowmen forming the wings and securing the front. They dug trenches between the hedgerows and constructed field fortifications to strengthen their position. Behind the army, a mounted reserve stood ready to exploit any breakthrough or launch a counterattack. On the 18th of September, as the two armies faced each other, King John II drew up his plan of attack. He was determined to avoid repeating the disaster of the Battle of Crécy. His troops had thoroughly reconnoitred the English position, were well rested, and the king had carefully considered how he wanted to proceed. He divided his forces, approximately 10,000 men-at-arms, 2,000 infantry, and 2,000 crossbowmen, into 3 divisions. Each division consisted of a central body of foot soldiers, flanked by crossbowmen. Aside from 2 smaller shock troops totaling 300 to 500 armored horsemen, all the men-at-arms fought on foot. On the morning of the 19th of September, Edward prepared for battle, but then, unexpectedly, ordered his left wing to retreat across the Mionçon. The French feared this might be a feint, designed to lure them into attacking an almost impregnable position, but they decided to take the chance and press the assault. One group of mounted men skirted the hedge on the right, aiming to strike the side of the exposed English centre, while another tried to force a gap through the bushes to attack the English right wing. When the first group reached the hedge, English archers caught them in a deadly crossfire. Arrows fell like rain, bringing down horses and routing their riders. Meanwhile, the second assault force had nearly reached the left flank of the English centre. Just as the riders accelerated to charge, the English left wing appeared behind them, having returned from the ford and launching a counterattack. Caught between 2 fronts and under heavy fire, the French men-at-arms could not hold their ground for long. With the rapid mounted assault having failed, the 1st French division on foot advanced. As they pushed through the hedgerows, they suffered heavy losses at the hands of the English archers. Nevertheless, the French reached the English front, and a bloody hand-to-hand battle ensued. Despite fierce fighting, the English line held firm, and after 2 hours, the French were forced to retreat. So far, all of King John's attacks had failed. However, 2/3 of his army was still fresh, while the English were exhausted. Many were wounded, and their archers were running low on arrows. Yet the French, once again, made a critical mistake. The 2nd Division interpreted the retreat of the first wave as a signal to pull back, abandoning the advance instead of maintaining pressure. This pause gave Edward time to regroup his troops before King John's 3rd Division could engage. France had squandered another opportunity. When King John attacked with the 3rd Division, he sent his crossbowmen ahead. Unlike the mercenaries at the Battle of Crécy, these troops were fully equipped. Step by step, they advanced up the slope with their pavises, securing the ground to the English front. slowly but surely, Edward's situation became precarious. Many of his archers had already set aside their bows, useless without arrows, and drawn their swords to engage in close combat. Yet the Black Prince still had one ace up his sleeve. Around 60 men-at-arms, accompanied by a few dozen mounted archers, had ridden in a wide arc around the hill to the right of the battlefield. Now they charged into the rear of King John's forces. This surprise attack proved a turning point. As the French scrambled to deal with the threat from behind them, the Black Prince ordered some of his men-at-arms to remount and strike the shattered formation from the front and flank. The English horsemen thundered down the hill, crashing into the French lines. John's division disintegrated under the force of the impact and soon collapsed completely, sealing the outcome of the battle. The French had suffered another crushing defeat. Around 2,500 of their men-at-arms were killed. Around 3,000 men, including King John himself, were taken prisoner. The English, by contrast, lost just 40 men-at-arms. Yet Poitiers also showed the English method was no longer infallible. A full third of the French army had never struck a blow, and still the victory was far harder won than most English triumphs of the previous 20 years. In earlier battles, the first volleys of arrows often decided the outcome, but at Poitiers, the result remained uncertain even after 100 volleys. When the first phase of the 100 Years' War ended with the Peace of Bretigny in 1360, the French had still not found a reliable way to counter the English tactical system. However, their adaptations, both tactical and technical, had made them far better able to withstand the firepower of the English longbowmen. Dismounted men-at-arms were less vulnerable to arrows than mounted ones, and heavier armor and the increasing use of pavises gave them even more protection. At the same time, mounted shock troops provided a mobile element for flanking attacks. But although these changes reduced the effectiveness of the English longbowmen against French men-at-arms, they were still not enough to overcome the full strength of English tactics. It was only when the war resumed in 1369 that the French finally found a way to counter the English system. After the Battle of Poitiers, Charles V assumed control of the government while his father remained a prisoner of the English. He realized the futility of continuing to counter the English tactics with direct confrontation, as it was not the most effective way to defeat them. The real underlying problem was that the English could plunder, raid, and besiege French territory unhindered, if they were not stopped. While battles were the usual means to prevent this, they were not the only option. Instead, Charles V adopted a Fabian strategy, meaning he avoided major engagements, instead relying on attrition and indirect attacks. In sieges and small-scale skirmishes, the French were easily able to keep pace with the English, and by 1374 they had recaptured nearly everything they had been forced to cede under the Peace of Bretigny. Yet Charles and his father recognized that lasting victory would require additional measures. In 1363 they began reforming the French armies, creating a modern war machine of their own. How these new powerful armies dealt with the English, however, is a topic for another video. To conclude, let me thank you for watching the video. I hope it's clear that this video took a lot of time and effort. We love to do this, but it's not easy and it takes a lot of resources. If you think these kinds of videos are worth your money, please consider supporting us on Patreon. It's a good way to support any creator. And for us, it means that we remain independent and can produce videos on topics that we like and that we think are important. So we don't have to cater to hype and trends, which in our opinion doesn't work well for a channel about history. Thank you. On the 24th of May 1565, the Ottoman artillery opened fire on Fort St. Elmo, one of the fortresses of the Knights Hospitaller. This was the beginning of the so-called Great Siege of Malta. Behind the artillery, an army of 40,000 soldiers was waiting to conquer the island. Sent there by Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, who wanted to strengthen the position of the Ottoman Empire in the struggle for supremacy in the Mediterranean and wipe out the Order of St. John, also known as the Knights Hospitaller, once and for all. But the Knights, together with the Maltese militia and a number of mercenaries, put up a fierce fight. Europe was trembling as the siege developed into a war of attrition of epic proportions. The possibility of an Ottoman bridgehead so close to Italy had never been more real. Before we dive straight into the video, a quick lesson on credential stuffing, which is how most account hacking happens nowadays. If you have used your usual email address on a website that was not properly maintained or got compromised, it might end up on the dark web. So if you have one password for more than one login, somebody might successfully log into your accounts. An easy fix is enabling two-factor authentication and tools such as the dark web monitor of today's sponsor NordVPN to get alerted. Be sure to use a password manager like NordPass to generate strong, unique passwords and always have them at hand without actually having to remember them. NordVPN also comes with a threat protection feature that keeps malicious websites, annoying trackers, and irritating advertisements at bay. Get Nord for the price of a cup of coffee per month by clicking on the link in the description below. All of this is entirely risk-free thanks to Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. As soon as Sultan Suleiman I, known as the Magnificent, rose to power in 1520, he pushed the expansion of the Ottoman Empire. His armies quickly secured control of most of the eastern Mediterranean. In 1522, they also conquered the island of Rhodes, which was then home to the Knights Hospitaller, who were a Catholic military order founded in Jerusalem after the First Crusade. After the fall of Jerusalem in 1291, they established a domain on Rhodes, where they thrived until 1522. 8 years later, Emperor Charles V granted them Malta as a perpetual fiefdom in exchange for one falcon annually. However, according to Kenneth M. Seton, an expert on the Crusades and Ottoman-European relations in the Mediterranean, the island was, quote, a defenseless, barren waste, end quote. Nevertheless, it had become the Knights' new home, and they immediately began to turn it into an important maritime center. At the same time, the Ottomans were expanding their influence in the western Mediterranean. The Barbary corsairs, privateers in Ottoman service, were gradually becoming an ever greater threat, especially a certain Dragut called the Drawn Sword of Islam. He was constantly at odds with the Maltese Knights. A few years later, in 1551, he and the Ottoman admiral Sinan Pasha attacked Malta directly. They landed on the island with about 10,000 men, but left only a few days later to conquer the neighboring island of Gonzo instead. Dragut then sailed to Tripoli, which was also garrisoned by the Knights, defeated them in a short siege and took control of the area. Tripoli then became the new center of corsair activity. Shocked by this direct blow, the Knights instantly set to improve Malta's defenses. They expected Dragut to return soon. Over the next few years, the situation in the Mediterranean remained tense. By 1559, hardly any coast in the western Mediterranean was safe from Dragut's corsairs. Among other things, he plundered the Spanish coast, which prompted Philip II, together with his allies, to equip a large fleet in order to drive them out of Tripoli. The Knights Hospitaller also joined this operation, but this mission failed. An Ottoman fleet under the experienced Admiral Piyale Pasha surprised the Christian ships near the Tunisian island of Djerba and defeated them. Afterward, the Grand Master of the Order, Jean Parisot de la Valette, expected the worst. He ordered to rebuild the fleet and had his men prepare. He was sure that the Ottomans would strike again, because foreign observers in Constantinople had reported that the Sultan was preparing a formidable fleet. Malta was an obvious target because the island was not only the headquarters of the Knights and thus of the Sultan's enemies, but also very significant strategically. It was the stepping stone to Sicily, from where the way to the western Mediterranean and especially to Italy would be wide open. When one of the most notorious sailors of the order, Maturadon-Dolescu, also called Rumga, attacked several merchant ships and captured the governors of Cairo and Alexandria. This was the straw that broke the camel's back. Suleiman decided to conquer Malta and annihilate the Knights Hospitaller once and for all. When the Ottoman fleet was spotted off the coast of Malta on the 18th of May, the Knights were ready. The Grand Master had made sure that plenty of supplies were stocked and that the defenses were prepared. The Knights' new home was situated ideally for a siege. Everything vital was located on the two peninsulas of Birgu and Sanglia, accessible only from the land side, where they were each guarded by a moat and massive walls. For some years, the Knights had reinforced Fort St. Angelo, their headquarters, and built two new fortifications, Fort St. Elmo and Fort St. Michael. These two fortresses had been raised in less than a year and now guarded the city's weakest points. St. Elmo towered over the entrance of the Grand Harbour, and St. Michael barred the way from the south. Between Sanglia and Birgu lay the city's galley port, which was blocked by a heavy iron chain. So anyone who made it past the new Fort St. Elmo into the Grand Harbour was going to be met with mighty bastions, massive ramparts, and a chain blocking access to the heart of the city. Malta was an indefensible waste, no more. When de la Valette learned that the invasion was imminent, he summoned the Knights of his order from all over Europe. But it was clear that the Knights Hospitaller wouldn't be able to defend the island without allies. So, for this reason, the Grand Master turned to the Catholic potentates of Europe for help. First and foremost, to Pope Pius IV, King Philip II of Spain, who had an immediate interest in Malta because of his possessions in southern Italy and Sicily, and had an obligation to help because the knights were his fiefs. Both the Pope and the King promised their help, while more members of the order and financial pestilence blew their way to Malta, those who were already there to protect the defenses. They cleared the terrain in front of the walls by demolishing many of the buildings south of Birgu and Sanglia. In addition, de la Valette ordered all grain, ripe or not, to be harvested and brought to the city, along with other supplies. The Ottomans should not find any food on the island. To the same end, he had all the wells which were not vital for the defenders contaminated, probably with animal carcasses. This scorched earth policy would shape the character of the fight decisively. The Ottomans were facing a set of formidable fortresses, which, according to the historian Desmond Seward, were defended by some 500 to 600 knights and 1,200 soldiers from Italy, Spain and Greece. These professionals were supported by non-professional fighters such as sailors and civilians. Although Galatian had never been fond of the Knights Hospitaller, whom they regarded, prompted a large number of them. I'm the tension and the terror. You pretend of the defenders. All in all, the Ottomans would have. No crowd craves a hero if there's no villain in the. You all know me as the big farming ally. You have to wrestle the sturdy walls and was taken. Could arrive anytime. On the 19th of May, 1565, the first 500 Ottomans Marza Sirocco, a port 6 kilometers south of the Grand Harbour. The Grand Master sent a detachment of cavalry and 300 arquebusiers to welcome them, but after a brief and bloody skirmish, the Maltese had to retreat. Their mission had been futile to begin with, as became clear when 25,000 more Ottomans landed on the island the next day. The invaders immediately began to build a fortified camp south of the Grand Harbor. There were so many of them that offensive action was out of question. And yet even further Ottoman reinforcements were to arrive over the course of the next few days, especially the corsairs from Dragut. According to Sultan's orders, Dragut was to assume supreme command. This was quite extraordinary because the Sultan's own commanders were men of high rank as well. The fleet was commanded by Piyale Pasha, the hero of Germa, and the land forces by the experienced Lala Mustafa Pasha. There was an ongoing rivalry between these two because Mustafa Pasha had been given special authority by the Sultan. Because of that, they had a hard time to agree on a strategy in their Council of War on the 21st of May, which was held just after a reconnaissance expedition had led to initial engagements south of Sanglia. Dragut had not arrived yet, so they had to talk it out among themselves. Piyale Pasha wanted to take Fort St. Elmo to give his fleet access to the port and the Grand Harbor. Mustafa Pasha was not too fond of this, and instead wanted to attack the poorly guarded inland capital of Medina first, so that they could avoid attacking St. Elmo and operate from a secure base afterward. After some discussion, Lala Mustafa gave in. He thought taking the fort could only be a matter of days. The same day, Ottoman workers set up a battery between the fort and Mount Skibaras, near present-day Valletta, and soon the first cannons opened fire. Simultaneously, sappers were digging trenches to cut St. Elmo off from the land side and slowly approached the walls under cover. Because of the rocky ground, this was hard work, and fortunately for the defenders, progressed only slowly. The Ottoman slow progress allowed the Knights Hospitaller to supply and reinforce the fort. On the 28th of May, the last large bombards were installed, and the fight for St. Elmo began in earnest. When on the 2nd of June, Dragut finally arrived on the island with the bulk of his corsairs, the drawn sword of Islam set up camp in St. George's Bay. He did not agree with the chosen plan of attack, because he considered conquering St. Elmo a waste of time. However, it was too late to change plans now, so St. Elmo served its purpose perfectly. It bought the Knights Hospitaller a lot of time. Because the Grand Master, Jean de la Valette, was well aware that the only way to prevail was help from outside, he devoted much of his energy to get assistance as fast as possible. He asked the man in charge of coordinating the Spanish support, Don Garcia de Toledo, who was the Viceroy of Sicily, to hurry up. The latter, however, hesitated because Philip II had ordered him to intervene only if he could do so without endangering the Spanish fleet.
By the way, have you guys ever noticed how like, some people have
also very actively beating the drum on the political stage was Pope Pius IV. He urged the Catholic princes to send men, money, and gunpowder. And even ordered a force to be raised for this purpose from his own resources. But despite the Pope's admonition, and the general concern raised across Europe by the proximity of such a formidable Ottoman fleet, little was happening for the time being. On the 3rd of June, another battery opened fire on Fort St. Elmo from Dragut Point. The resulting artillery barrage kept the defenders so occupied that they only noticed the attacking Janissaries when it was too late. The Ottomans quickly seized the reveille, and in spite of 5 hours of fierce fighting, the defenders couldn't retake it. This was decisive because the Ottomans now held an elevated position right at the walls of St. Elmo. They finished a new artillery platform on the ruins, and their cannonballs started to shatter the walls from close range. Over time, constant battles and dwindling supplies weakened the defenders. After another assault on the 8th of June, the demoralized knights asked de la Valette for his consent to withdraw, but the Grand Master ordered them to stand firm. He knew they were fighting a losing battle, but every day they resisted meant an additional day for help to arrive. Soon the walls of St. Elmo were crumbling. 2 more assaults on the 15th and 16th of June were barely pushed back. But in the Ottoman camp, Dragut was dissatisfied. St. Elmo was costing the Ottomans far too much time. To speed things up, he ordered his ships to join the bombardment from the sea, and personally visited the trenches to instruct his artillerymen to aim lower and thus bring down the walls more quickly. But his impatience was to cost him dearly. The sources disagree as to whether he was struck down by a lucky shot from St. Angelo or whether one of the gunners who was correcting accidentally aimed too low. In any case, a stone or bullet hit him in the head. 5 days later, the sword of Islam died of his injuries. Regardless of the setback, Mustafa Pasha, who was now in charge, finally managed to cut off St. Elmo by establishing another battery on Gallows Point. This left St. Elmo under fire from all sides, so that the conditions of both the defenses and the defenders deteriorated quickly. When further assaults branded against the defenses on the 21st and 22nd of June, the defenders couldn't prevent the Janissaries from lodging themselves in on the walls. Starved, exhausted, and nearly overrun, the knight's resistance on the following morning was a symbolic formality. They stood no chance. The Ottomans entered the fort and killed all the defenders except for a handful of lucky ones who managed to swim to safety. The events following the fall of St. Elmo were highly controversial. For example, the archivist Catherine Desportes reports that Lala Mustafa Pasha had the bodies of the knights mutilated and thrown into the sea and the heads of the fort's commanders impaled along the shore. De la Valette allegedly responded by having the Ottoman prisoners beheaded and their heads shot from the cannons of St. Angelo. However, many historians doubt that such atrocities actually occurred, because the primary sources give conflicting evidence. Nevertheless, what is certain is that the Battle of St. Elmo cost many lives.
To be honest, guys,
According
I'm
to the
gonna go live
historian
tomorrow.
Bruce about 1,500 defenders and 6,000 attackers died, including half
5
of the Janissaries.
to approximately
What
8
about
I'll be
the
live, or
Ottomans,
maybe
more
9.
than the loss of their soldiers?
But I'm gonna